life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact, and that is everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you.
It's August 2018 and Apple has just been announced as the first American company to be valued at $1 trillion. To add context to what I just said, that's a company worth more than Disney, Walmart, ExxonMobil, Coca-Cola, and McDonald's combined. Whether you are a devoted Apple customer or not, we can all agree that Apple has changed the way humans work, and in the process, they have become one of the greatest, if not the greatest company of all time. But it's important to note that it wasn't always this way. A little over 25 years ago, Apple was on the verge of insolvency and had become the laughingstock of Silicon Valley. In really simple terms, the company was a disaster, constantly shuffling CEOs, delivering bad financial results. The company that once promised to change the world really needed help to survive. Apple essentially became a lost company. The founding spirit was gone, and so was the innovation. During this period, Microsoft and IBM, two of Apple's biggest rivals, were on top of the world. Computers using Windows accounted for about 80% of the market, whilst Apple's market share could hardly break 11%. Someone needed to do something fast and turn things around to change the fortunes of Apple. So Joe Amelio, the CEO of Apple at the time, had an idea. He convinced the board of directors that he had a plan that could potentially turn things around at the failing company. A few months later, one of the most shocking announcements would be made. It was actually happening. This was no prank. Apple had just announced plans to bring Steve Jobs back into the company 11 years after he left by acquiring his startup Next for almost $500 million. Now this was the exact moment. The stage was set for what would be the greatest comeback story in the history of business. But wait, how did Apple get to this point of needing a turnaround to survive in the first place? Apple's origin story is one of the most popular in the world of business. It's a tale of two friends creating a product that they genuinely believed would change the world. And in typical Silicon Valley fairy tale format, they start in a garage and in a few years, they grow their business to be worth millions of dollars.
I was worth about over $1 million when I was 23, and over $10 million when I was 24, and over $100 million when I was 25.
A few years after Apple's launch in 1976, the company became a global success story. The Apple II was in many ways a revolutionary product because it was the first computer that really looked like a consumer device. It had color, an inbuilt keyboard, and it simply looked cool for that era. It was something the world had never seen, and the result? A massive hit, selling over 4.8 million units worldwide. By December 20, 1980, Apple would have the biggest IPO since Ford Motors in the 1950s. The IPO made Jobs a multi-millionaire with a net worth of over $250 million. With fire in his eyes and his newfound fame, Steve Jobs was perfect for the media. He would constantly make fun of IBM and paint them as a company that didn't care about creating great products. By 1981, Apple was one of the top companies in the personal computer industry. That same year, IBM would enter the market with their first personal computer product, the IBM PC. Blinded by their recent success, Apple felt they had an edge over IBM and didn't seem to care about their new product. Steve Jobs would take out a full-page ad in the newspaper with the headline, "Welcome IBM." Seriously, Unknown to Jobs, IBM launched the PC with an insane marketing strategy, and in just 2 years, the IBM PC surpassed the Apple II as the best-selling personal computer. The people at Apple were not feeling so good anymore. In a bid to get the company back on track, the board of directors decided that Jobs was too young and inexperienced to run a big company like Apple. They felt like it had become bigger than him, hence the need for a more experienced executive. Now this would lead to a decision that would change everything at the company. The board of directors would get Jobs to interview about 20 applicants, most of whom were top business executives in the tech world at the time. Unimpressed by any of them, he would turn them down. You see, Jobs was a marketing genius. He wasn't looking for another tech maestro. He was in search of someone who had sufficient experience in leading change in an industry. A rebel in the computer industry himself, he was going to be attracted to someone who had gone against an industry giant in another industry. And Jobs had one man in mind who ticked all these boxes. His name? John Scully. The man had grown in the ranks of Pepsi to become the CEO in just 10 years. He led the Pepsi Challenge campaign that sparked a rivalry with Coca-Cola and had a reputation as a marketing genius. Jobs had found his man, and he made his decision on the 8th of April, 1983. Unknown to Jobs, this decision would haunt him in less than 2 years. Since the success of the Apple II, the company was desperately in need of another successful product. The Apple III and Lisa computers were launched as follow-ups to the Apple II, but both were commercial failures. Apple had one final product to bank on, the Macintosh.
You've just seen some pictures.
In early 1984, for the first time ever, Steve Jobs introduced the Macintosh in iconic fashion at an Apple stakeholders meeting. The Macintosh was like a work of art. It was praised to be a revolutionary product. It was small, relatively inexpensive, and the amazing graphic user interface made it really unique. Adding to the buzz of the newly introduced Mac, Apple aired what has been described to be the greatest ad ever made. 1984. The message was simple. IBM was the cold dictator of the computer industry, and Apple was supposed to be the hope for the world. The Mac was the most talked about product at the time, especially after the 1984 ad aired at the halftime during the Super Bowl. But that didn't necessarily translate into commercial success. Although the launch of the Mac created a lot of buzz, most people thought the Macintosh was simply too radical for that era. The launch of the Mac also exposed the vast differences in the management styles of Steve Jobs and John Scully. It's March 1985. Scully walks into Jobs' office asking him to kindly cease his duties as the head of the Macintosh team. Now, Scully and Jobs had fallen into different altercations throughout 1984. After the launch of the Mac, Jobs wanted the Mac to be the focus of Apple's operations, whereas Scully was more concerned with the sales of the Apple II because it was still the company's best-selling product. It was one disagreement after another, and at that point, Jobs had just one thing in mind: to kick Scully out of the company. Jobs decided that he was going to convince the members of the board to join forces with him to get rid of his newfound rival, and he was confident that he would get the backing of the board. However, the reverse was the case. On a fateful morning at the Apple headquarters back in 1985, Scully confronted Jobs in a board meeting, and the board of directors were asked to make a decision. They sided with Scully, and Jobs was relieved of his duties as head of any team at Apple. Jobs was made chairman, a purely ceremonial title that limited his activities in the day-to-day running of the company. It seemed like the end of a fairy tale that lasted its course. Steve Jobs was done. Or was he? The public had questions. Loyal customers of Apple and fans of the charismatic CEO wondered what was next. What was the future of Apple going to look like without Jobs? What was Jobs going to do without Apple? After his very public exit from the company he created, Steve Jobs went into hiding for a while. According to him, he wanted to completely run out of Silicon Valley. However, months later, he decided that he was simply going to do what he loved the most, and that is creating great products. This was the beginning of Next, a computer company founded by Jobs alongside 5 senior Apple employees that were loyal to him and his vision. Although Next computers were marketed to the financial, scientific, and academic communities, highlighting its innovative technology, they really struggled to make sales. A few years later, and after the failure of the computers to break into the market, Next decided to pack up on the hardware and focus on what really made their company special: their incredible operating system. Next software was a direct reflection of the genius and rejuvenated creative drive of Steve Jobs. However, Next wasn't the only company on his mind. Not so long after Jobs left Apple, he bought a little animation company from Lucasfilms. The company would go on to release some of the most iconic feature films in history, like Toy Story, and would change the face of the movie industry forever. The name? Pixar. Pixar would eventually go public, making Jobs a billionaire. Now, Next had become a software vendor, and their incredible software was very popular amongst financial institutions, whereas at Apple, the journey looked all but finished. The company that once thrived had become worse than a shadow of itself. IBM was constantly out-earning Apple and had cemented itself as the leader of the personal computer market. Apple needed something dramatic to turn its fortune around. Then CEO Joe Amelio knew that Jobs and Next were sitting on software that could do Apple a world of good. So he led one of the most shocking moves in business history. Late 1996, 11 years after his exit, Apple announced plans to bring co-founder Steve Jobs back into the company he created by acquiring his startup, Next, for almost $500 million. A few months later, at the January Macworld Expo in 1997, Steve Jobs joined the CEO on stage as a keynote speaker. Just 5 months after that, Jobs persuaded the board to oust Amelio and make him the interim CEO, eventually the permanent CEO. This was crazy, but it was happening. Steve Jobs was finally back at Apple, but things weren't rosy yet. After Jobs was appointed the CEO, Michael Dell, the CEO of Dell Computers, famously said that if he were in Jobs' shoes, he would completely shut down the company and give money back to the shareholders. That's how down bad Apple was as a company. 1997 was the year Apple was really at the edge. The company couldn't afford to have another failed product. In many ways, it was the decisive year for this computer company. Firstly, in August 1997, during the first Macworld Expo as CEO of Apple, Steve Jobs had a special announcement for his audience, and it wasn't something they would ever expect. Apple had just taken a $150 million investment from its longtime rivals, Microsoft. As the audience booed Bill Gates, who was looking on from the large screen, Steve Jobs simply said, "We need all the help we can get." Secondly, Jobs believed that what Apple needed the most was a clear definition of what they were about and what they stand for as a company. And as a result, he cooked up the Think Different campaign. It became the tagline of Apple's resurgence, something that characterized their essence. Finally, Jobs, being more mature, understood that he needed help because he was the CEO of Pixar and Apple at the same time. He hired Tim Cook to lead the operations worldwide, a decision that he would be grateful for years later. Jobs had set up the structure, but one thing was still missing: a hit product. With very little room for error this time, what would happen would stun the entire world. A year after Microsoft's investment, Apple would release the iMac, a new computer co-designed by Jobs and Apple's new creative designer, Jonathan Ive. It came in multiple colors. It was a computer like the world had never seen. It was a design masterpiece, and the result, it was a massive hit. The year was 2001. The music industry had several issues, and at the top of the list were piracy and illegal file sharing. This was when Apple would launch a digital music player that promised 1,000 songs in your pocket. Not long after the launch of the iPod, Apple would open the iTunes music store, turning the iPod into the center of a digital media universe. iTunes and iPod would hit Windows and jumpstart Apple's music play. The iPod quickly became one of the best-selling tech products of all time, with over 150 million units sold in 10 years. In 6 years, Apple had gone from being a laughingstock in the tech world to a force to reckon with. From 2003 to 2006, Apple went from $6 per share to about $80 per share. Apple wasn't just back to business stability. The company was at its very best. The iMac and iPod series were massive hits that dramatically turned the fortunes of the company around. Most people in their position would have been content, basking in the glory of their incredible comeback, but not Steve Jobs. In 2007, at the Macworld Expo, that had become a cultural phenomenon, Steve Jobs would announce the launch of yet another revolutionary product, one that promised to change human interaction forever.
The new iPhone, those long lines are forming. The frenzy does not seem to die down.
Hundreds of customers camped outside the Apple stores overnight just to be the first to purchase the iPhone. Not to state the obvious, but the iPhone didn't just change the phone industry. It was a massive commercial success, selling over 1 million units in less than 3 months. A few months after the iPhone launched, the App Store was launched, allowing iPhone users to install software from non-Apple developers. Apple was back at the forefront of business. They were making more money than they had ever made, and most importantly, they were making great products. While the company made giant strides in business, the CEO's health was in steady decline. In 2009, Tim Cook was appointed interim CEO while Jobs took an extended leave because of his health. Jobs would deliver his last keynote in early 2011, introducing the iPad 2 and the iCloud service. Not long after his keynote, Jobs would step down as Apple CEO. On October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs was announced dead, and Tim Cook became the permanent CEO. At the time of his death, Apple was the most valuable company in the world. And today, over 25 years since Jobs returned to Apple, the company remains the most valuable company in the world.